28th of March 2019. Okay, I'm going to go through the delayed choice quantum eraser. It's actually just some brief overviews about what a quantum does, and this demonstration, it's a very basic level understanding of kind of how they're trying to use them in quantum computers. I'm not going to get real in depth, but if you have any comments, leave them. I just want to make a quick comparison with regards to philosophical discussion. So essentially what we have here is a quantum, and what it usually displays before you observe its path, or the data of its path, is it displays as a waveform. They call this the wave of possibility. Essentially this is every possible state that it could be in, and they're depicting it in a visual sense. So what will happen eventually, though, is if you look at the quantum, they call it a collapse. And when it collapses, it only shows a limited number of possibilities. And it'll kind of look like that. Now, the difference is there's two holes in both of the states. And because when you're not looking at it, for whatever reason, it acts like a wave. And when a wave goes through two holes, there's interference, and the interference shows up as a pattern like this. But when it acts like a particle, when you look at the data, it acts like a particle. This quantum literally goes back in time, if you will. They suggest it goes back in time, and it literally picks a pathway, and it looks like it's demonstrating particle behavior. So I started getting some ideas. I'm not going to go on about the background of why these ideas came about, but these ideas started to develop, and they started to look like, I'll leave all these links here for you. They started to look like something I found out later, which was called the Born rule. And Einstein didn't like it because he actually derived it from observing other laws and other individuals' interpretations. Essentially, it says within a quantum interpretation of quantum theory, the Born rule is seen as an extension of the standard law of total probability, which takes into account of Hilbert's space dimension of the physical system involved. In the ambit of so-called hidden measurements interpretation of quantum mechanics, the Born rule can be derived by averaging all overall possible measure interactions that can take place between the quantum entity and measuring the system. Now, I think this is what he's saying. I found this out later, because right when I was thinking about stuff that I'll demonstrate here with something that we might be more familiar with, I seen this article. It came out literally a day after I started thinking about this stuff, and I was actually writing about it. That's where I just decided, you know what, I'm going to make a YouTube channel and bounce this stuff off of people, see what they say. But essentially, what this means, and my understanding of what I think it means is, and that I tried to make a video and I covered several other topics, but I'm going to try to narrow it just to one topic right now, and I'll cover some other ones down the road. I'll label them the same thing, but this is going to be part one of a small series. Now, this scripture is what I think it has relevance to what I'm talking about, these earthly things. And this scripture says, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, in the last trumpet. Okay, so before this, there's, we'll just go with this. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, okay, and the last trumpet. So I refer to the trumpet, and this scripture came to mind immediately, as the waveform with the interference, because obviously what a waveform is, it's pretty much like frequency. You know how they say light is both a particle and a wave? Well, in the quantum, it'll display its waveform first before it collapses. So, and I thought it was interesting that it says in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. In the twinkling of eye is actually what they describe as the observation of data. And I started associating it that way. And once you observe the data of the pathway of what gate it came through between the two slot experiment, this, in the quantum sense, turns into a particle. So that's where I thought this scripture was interesting, because then it says the dead will be raised and imperishable, and we will be changed. So they're describing change here. Now, the scripture talks about the spiritual aspects that affect and manifest the physical world. So I can't tell you how the spiritual works. I can't. But this is clearly describing a change in the physical world. And it's describing a change in the physical world that looks a lot like the effects of the observations that we make with the quantum. So you might actually be able to associate that now that I was able to put more detail. I kind of left a lot of things open. Not a lot of explanation. I just kind of went through a couple of associated things I thought that were, real close to it. But that's more background information. Now you can actually probably connect what I'm saying by, giving me more description. Like I said, I'll leave this here. This generally talks about the same stuff here as this Wikipedia. The fact of the matter is, though, they're trying to revive this rule and try to see if it has any validity. And I think that's interesting because I started to come across all this stuff at the same time. So there's some other scripture I think that would have associations. And I talked about the last video, and I'm gonna start talking about this pathway, and I'm not gonna leave this here for a second, which is marriage. And I talked about the ceremony of marriage first. Now, the ceremony of marriage in the developed idea of the Christian culture, well, I don't know where it came from, but I think it's very interesting that the ceremony of marriage starts with the wedding procession, the music first, and then in comes the bride. And at that point in time, the bride and the groom, they get married, and they're changed. And the scripture says that is why man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now, I'll remind you, this scripture is describing earthly things. And it doesn't say why with regards to heavenly spiritual reasoning, but it's saying these things to give us an understanding of our physical world. And the association with that is, and I'll show you here in just a second, it's more closely aligned on how we actually use quantum computers. So I'm going to lead into that in just a second. But nonetheless, the ceremony of a marriage I found very closely tied with just the observation of a quantum. Essentially, you have the ceremony, the music, the auditory effect that's prepping you. It's giving you information on what's going to happen. And from there, you get an idea of what's going to happen. The bride comes through, and the marriage happens, and the two become one. And with that said, the wave of possibilities, if you will, it's narrowed down to just what the outcome is. And that's where my whole idea came about, and I would describe it as generally that sound is actually not sound, but the wave of possibility is actually the precursor. And this is where I came up with this. I actually found the Bourne rule afterwards, and I don't know if it's exactly the same thing, but the wave of possibility is actually the information to prep us to understand what we're gonna experience with regards to the collapsed quantum. So not that they're separate entities, but that they're actually one's describing the other. One is giving you information for the other. And the other description I put in the book, and I don't have it on hand right now, is essentially kind of like going into a movie theater. When you go into a movie theater, you experience the movie on two levels. And from one perspective, with regards to two-dimensional visual effects of the screen in front of you. But essentially, the auditorial effects of the movie describes something that's happening. And if you've ever gone into a movie theater just hearing it, you don't really know what's going on. Or if you've ever watched a movie without hearing it, you're not really sure what you're supposed to be seeing, but you're seeing it. It's a little clearer to you. You can determine what's really going on a lot better when you're seeing it. But the importance of sound is unmistakable, and for some reason we have eyes and ears that both measure frequency. They both are stimulated by frequency, but they're a different type of frequency, a different type of stimuli, and they generate a perspective of the world around us in a way that makes this three-dimensional world that we interact with dynamic, and that's why we don't have, I guess, ears on our eyes, if you will. But essentially, they are measuring frequency, just a different type of frequency in a different type of way, and it's all coming together in our minds with regards to our world. And I believe that's what Born was saying. I believe that's what they're starting to study up on and try to focus in on. And I don't think that either one of them can be separated. And for some reason, I think somehow the marriage procession actually got thrown into that. And it was merely carrying on a tradition that maybe someone understood at one point, but then the tradition was lost, or the actual meaning maybe been lost. But so I'm going to go on to the marriage part of it, and the two become one. So now, with regards to this is saying that we are now one individual once we are married. And the interesting thing about that is when we developed quantum computers and used this thing, I think it's called a qubit. When we decided to use a qubit, essentially we took those qubits, and it's just the oddest thing with these things. What you do is you take them, you split a qubit into two separate entities, and each entity has one half the energy as the other. And I'm going to see if I can bring up this article, but the Chinese actually shot a qubit up into space with lasers, is what I'm to understand. And what they did is they generated pretty much the delayed choice quantum erase experiment, if you will. And when they observed the quantum, it collapsed. And this collapse was exactly what happens in the experiment. The interesting thing is, not only did it collapse, not only did the one half collapse in space when it was observed in space, the one that was still on Earth collapsed at the exact same time. There was no delay. And so whatever's going on between these two quantums, literally, they are tied together, and they both collapse at exactly the same time. Now, in some ways, this is determined to be an effect that is occurring that's faster than the speed of light. Now, they can't say that it's actually traveling at the speed of light because there's some unknown source that connects these two halves. Now, this is where I go back into the marriage thing. And I don't know if this is the same thing. This could be a frequency thing. This could be a harmonics or resonance thing. But you've heard where a couple, one gets sick and dies, and the other member of that couple, maybe they pass away within weeks. Maybe it's a year or less, but something happens there. And I've heard stories, I've had stories myself where you've been with somebody for so long, and you didn't get to make that last decision to get married, but it's almost like you can feel them. And that's where I think this could fall into play. Now, it could be harmonics. It could be that you're so in tune with the person, you're in tune with their harmonics, and somehow there's a sending and receiving of messages. But it believe me, these things are explaining earthly things. So there could also be a quantum effect going on, or some sort of quantum sensing that we are just not aware of. And if this scripture is suggesting something in terms of a quantum, did I close it? if the scripture with regards to two becoming one, it has to do with the earth. Essentially, we are one. We are one nuclei. When you get married with your wife, you are one nuclei. And when you separate, you're really acting like a qubit. Now, will science in the future prove this? Maybe, maybe not. But the electromagnetism, believe it or not, there's some sort of dipole movement with regards to atoms and nuclei. It's so small. It's so hard to detect, and it's so guarded by the electron cloud that it's, doing experiments with so much noise, electrical noise and everything else, electromagnetic noise. I think that's right. I don't think we'll be able to detect this, anytime soon. But I know there's a lot of people that, I've heard stories that they say that, they could feel their significant other. And, I could go on about that. But I'm going to look at a couple other scripture, and I'm going to wrap it up here, which I think it's all relevant. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. And you can kind of see the two different states. If you're well familiar with this experiment, this stuff kind of, you can actually say, I wonder if that has anything to do with that. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes light. Now that's kind of more of a frequency thing, something that I spoke about with. Let's see, and there's nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or nothing that will not be made known. Now, with that said, maybe this is also telling us that one day we're going to find all these hidden things. Just not too long ago, we found out that some humans have magnetic reception. So, therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God. Now, those could be heavenly things. Those could also have earthly references. At first I did think the heart is the nucleus of an atom. And but definitely, you can look at that for face value. You can look at that with regards to law. But some of these scriptures, there's a lot of depth to them. There are also heavenly bodies, and there are also earthly bodies. And now I think this is pretty interesting and pretty important. So if some of the scripture is describing earthly bodies, it's going to have some sort of, what I think Einstein tried to zero in on, is a universal application, something that would explain what's going on in the universe. And so that the earthly bodies, says, but the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. And here it says, I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? So, now that's a mouthful, but in the end, there's a lot of mysteries of this earth, and I think they're definitely revealed in the Bible. I seen some interesting thing about different hidden messages in the Bible, and just different ways you can look at them from a lot of different perspectives with regards to notes. I think I might have went over some of that, with regards to numerology, but I'm not trying to lose too much track of the spiritual implications that they're trying to show us here in this scripture. But that's all I have. If you got any questions or comments, be sure to put them down. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video. I think I pretty much went over a lot better this time, at least with regards to marriage. And then finally, what I would also like to reference is the NFL halftime show. I tried to briefly put that in there in the last video, and essentially, I think what you're seeing here is maybe just good fun. But there's a lot of symbolism that's coming up everywhere, and it's a lot of it's talked about everywhere, with a lot of different groups. A lot of different groups that are well known and far back in the history of our home nation, and then in the different parts of the world. But I did wonder if the symbolism that they're trying to show us there wasn't having to do with almost with what that scripture refers to. You have the trumpets playing, you have the flash within the twinkling of an eye, and then you have the change. Now, the other thing I do want to mention is if you read anything about Moses and the Egyptians, I think that story is interesting, but it's also significant in the effect that there may come a time where there's going to be things that are being done, and even today, that no one would ever imagine that they could ever do, like men being able to control stars in the sense that Scripture suggested it, and they're going to be able to do these things when it was only implied by the God of Moses. And the Egyptians had a little bit of a tussle there with Moses because they were like, hey, we can do all these things too. And then there came to a point where they couldn't do them. And the Pharaoh backed down. I mean, you read the story. You know how it turned out for him. So, not to be confused with these things, if this stuff, the science starts to develop, God give us if we ever make it into our gods. So, thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me on The Curve.